The rain fell in heavy, gray sheets the day Emma's grandfather was buried. The cemetery was crowded with distant relatives, somber neighbors, and faces she hadn't seen in years, most of whom weren't there for grief, but for curiosity. They whispered behind black umbrellas, wondering what would happen next, because everyone knew that her grandfather, Harold Whitmore, had left behind more than a legacy. He had left behind money, a lot of it. Emma stood quietly beside the casket, her eyes red from both tears and exhaustion. Her grandfather had raised her after her parents died in a car accident when she was 10. He was more than family. He was her entire world. But as the priest's voice faded into the distance and the final handful of soil was tossed into the grave, Emma's heart grew heavy with something more than grief. Her uncle, Richard Whitmore, had returned. Richard was Harold's younger brother, the kind of man who smiled too easily and spoke too sweetly when he wanted something. Years ago, he had borrowed money from Harold's business, a loan that was never repaid. When Harold found out Richard had used it to gamble and start fake ventures, he cut him off completely. The brothers hadn't spoken in nearly 15 years, and yet there he was, standing at the graveside, dressed in a black suit that couldn't hide the arrogance beneath. He offered Emma a sympathetic pat on the shoulder and spoke words of comfort that felt hollow. His eyes, though, kept drifting, not to the grave, but to the old lawyer, Mr. Callahan, who held a weathered brown folder close to his chest. That folder contained the will. After the funeral, everyone was invited back to Harold's estate, a sprawling country home that had been in the family for generations. The mood was heavy, but tension hummed beneath the surface like a low electrical current. People pretended to mourn, but what they were really waiting for was the reading of the will. Emma sat quietly in the study, the fire crackling behind her. Mr. Callahan began reading aloud from the document. Most of the extended family received polite mentions, small sums, sentimental heirlooms, gestures of closure. But then came the part that made everyone hold their breath. Harold had left everything, the estate, the businesses, and the financial assets, to Emma. Gasps filled the room. Richard's face tightened. His hand gripped the armrest of his chair so hard his knuckles turned white. The lawyer continued, clarifying that Emma would fully inherit once she turned 25, just 6 months away. Until then, the assets would remain under the supervision of the executor, also named in the will. That executor was Richard Whitmore. It was a clever, dangerous arrangement, one Harold likely thought would force the family to reconcile. But Emma knew her uncle too well. He wasn't interested in reconciliation. He was interested in control. The meeting ended awkwardly. Relatives offered Emma half-hearted congratulations before leaving, whispering in corners, glancing toward Richard as though waiting for him to make his move. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. The house felt colder without her grandfather. Every creak of the wooden floorboards reminded her that she was alone, or nearly alone. She knew her uncle would find a way to take what wasn't his. It was only a matter of time. Over the next few days, Richard settled into the estate under the pretense of helping manage affairs. He brought with him 2 assistants, both men who looked more like bodyguards than accountants. He claimed they were there to help with paperwork, but Emma noticed how they watched her, their eyes always following her movements. He began by taking control of her grandfather's office, locking the door and forbidding anyone from entering. He said it was for inventory purposes. Then, bank statements began to disappear from the mail. Calls from the family's lawyer went unanswered or redirected. Emma started to realize that her grandfather's will wasn't just a document, it was a game board, and her uncle had already made his first move. The next week, Mr. Callahan called Emma privately. His tone was careful, hesitant. He warned her that Richard had begun transferring small amounts of money from the family business accounts into temporary holdings. It wasn't technically illegal. Not yet, but it was suspicious. Emma felt a cold anger growing inside her. She wanted to trust the system, but she knew her uncle's type. He'd twist every rule until it broke. That's when she made her decision. She wouldn't confront him directly. She wouldn't scream or accuse. She would do what her grandfather had always taught her to do when facing deceit. She would observe. So, Emma began to plan. She found the small, silver recording pen her grandfather once used during board meetings. It looked like a simple pen, but it had a built-in microphone and memory drive. She charged it, tested it, and then left it casually on the desk where her uncle often made his phone calls. The next day, She installed a second recorder, a tiny camera hidden inside one of the antique vases on the mantelpiece. From its angle, it captured nearly the entire room, including the desk and the safe. She moved carefully, pretending to stay out of Richard's way while secretly setting her trap. She backed up all financial files from her grandfather's computer to a hidden drive and made copies of key documents that Richard didn't know existed. Each night, she reviewed the footage. At first, it was boring Richard pacing, drinking, making calls. But soon, the mask began to slip. He started talking about moving funds before the deadline and making sure the girl doesn't notice. He wasn't just manipulating, he was stealing. And then, one night, Emma caught something even worse. Richard sat in the office with one of his assistants, holding a paper that looked suspiciously like a new will. He was planning to forge their grandfather's signature, to replace the original document and make himself the sole heir. Emma's stomach twisted as she watched the scene unfold. Every word, every smirk, every criminal act was captured clearly in the hidden camera's view. By the end of the recording, her heart was pounding. She copied the footage onto several flash drives and hid them in different parts of the house, just in case. She knew now that her uncle wouldn't stop until he had everything, but she also knew something he didn't. She had the power to destroy him. As the storm raged outside that night, the house shook with thunder. Somewhere in the dark, Richard was plotting his next move. But Emma, quietly and carefully, was already ahead of him. The battle for her inheritance had begun, and this time she wouldn't lose. The following days passed in an uneasy silence that seemed to echo through the halls of the old Whitmore estate. The house, once filled with her grandfather's warmth and laughter, now felt like a cage, one where Emma could hear every whisper, every lie, every calculated move of the man who shared her last name. Her uncle had begun to act differently, more confident, more controlling. He now held meetings in the dining hall with bankers and lawyers she didn't recognize, and when she entered the room, they would fall silent, pretending to shuffle papers or discuss unimportant details. But Emma knew what was happening. Richard was setting the stage, moving money, rewriting histories, and positioning himself as the rightful heir before her 25th birthday could make her inheritance official. She had the recordings, yes, but she knew evidence meant nothing if she couldn't prove intent. And for that, she needed him to reveal himself, not in whispers, not in secret, but in the open. Late one night, Emma sat alone in her grandfather's old study, staring at the flickering light of her laptop. The footage she'd gathered so far showed Richard discussing the forgery and bragging about transferring funds. But it wasn't enough to bring him down legally. He was careful never to name names, never to sign anything himself. He used his assistants as his hands, keeping his own fingerprints clean. That was when Emma remembered something her grandfather once said. If someone wants to take from you, let them. The greedy always reveal themselves when they think they've won. So Emma decided to let him think he was winning. She started by pretending to withdraw, becoming distant, distracted, and submissive. She let Richard believe she had lost interest in the inheritance altogether. She stopped asking about the business. She even allowed him to handle the finances completely, giving him the illusion of control. In truth, every move he made was being documented. Emma upgraded her setup. The small camera in the vase was joined by two new ones, one hidden in a bookshelf, another behind the grandfather clock. The pen recorder was now replaced with a discreet voice-activated device beneath the desk. Each night, she copied the recordings to encrypted drives and stored them in a hidden compartment behind a painting in her bedroom. One of her grandfather's favorites, the watchful eye, and the irony wasn't lost on her. Richard, meanwhile, became bolder. He threw small gatherings at the estate, entertaining potential buyers for the family land, claiming Emma had no interest in maintaining it. He charmed investors, lawyers, and even local officials. The arrogance in his voice grew with every passing day. But it was his arrogance that would eventually undo him. One evening, Emma noticed that her grandfather's signature stamp, a metal seal used for business contracts, was missing from the safe. She checked the recordings. There it was, Richard. After midnight, using the key she thought only she had, opening the safe and taking it. He was preparing to finalize the forgery. The next morning, Emma received a call from Mr. Callahan. His voice trembled with unease. Someone had submitted a new version of Harold Whitmore's will for review. one claiming that Emma had agreed to transfer all assets to Richard in exchange for a lifetime care arrangement. Her blood ran cold. It was a perfect plan. Almost. The signature was convincing, the notary seal was falsified, and Richard had manipulated dates to make it look legitimate. But what he didn't know was that Emma had every step of his scheme on camera. Still, she couldn't go to the police yet. If she did, he'd deny everything. He'd twist the story, use his connections, and call her delusional. She had to let him finish, let him believe the trap was working, before she struck back. So she played the role of the quiet, grieving niece. She let him continue to move pieces on the board, waiting for the moment when he'd reveal his hand completely. And then, as if fate were testing her resolve, the estate's housekeeper, Mrs. Doyle, came to her one evening. She was a kind, elderly woman who had worked for Harold for decades. Her hands trembled as she held out a piece of paper. It was a letter, one Richard had accidentally left in the trash. It was from a handwriting expert. The note confirmed that the signature on the secondary will has been adjusted successfully. No traceable mismatch remains. That was it? The proof she needed. Emma scanned the letter, added it to her growing collection of evidence, and uploaded everything. The videos, the audio recordings, the letter, to a secure cloud drive under a fake name. But she didn't stop there. She made 5 USB copies and mailed them to trusted contacts, Mr. Callahan, her friend Jenna, and even an investigative journalist who had once interviewed her grandfather. She didn't plan to use them yet, only if something happened to her. But Richard was getting restless. He started asking strange questions, whether she had spoken to the lawyer, whether she'd been in the office, whether she'd seen the safe recently. The tone of his voice was sharper, colder. He knew she was watching, and one night it became terrifyingly clear. Emma woke to the sound of her door handle turning. The clock read 2:43 a.m. She froze. The door creaked open, and a shadow crossed her floor. Tall, deliberate, familiar. Richard stepped inside, holding a flashlight. He moved slowly, scanning the room. His hand brushed against the painting on the wall, the one hiding her flash drives. He paused. For a second, it felt like the world stopped. Emma held her breath, terrified the sound of her heartbeat would give her away. Then, after a long moment, Richard lowered his flashlight and stepped back. He left the room without a word. The next morning, he was all smiles again, serving breakfast, pretending nothing had happened. But Emma knew now that he suspected her. The game was no longer secret. The hunter had realized he was being watched, and soon he would strike. The morning after Richard's quiet intrusion felt different. The air heavier, the silence sharper. Emma could no longer pretend this was a game. Her uncle had crossed from greed into menace, and now every shadow in the house seemed to carry his presence. The Whitmore estate, once her sanctuary, had become her battlefield. She moved carefully, avoiding the main halls, using the servants' corridors just as she had when she was a child. She had hidden cameras in almost every key room now, but she knew it wouldn't matter if he found the drives. The thought of him discovering her evidence sent a chill down her spine. By noon, Richard had announced that he was reorganizing the estate, closing off certain rooms including the study and the East Library, claiming they were being renovated. He fired Mrs. Doyle under the pretense of downsizing, and 2 unfamiliar men, clearly hired muscle, took her place. Emma's freedom within her own home vanished overnight. She began noticing strange details, her bedroom door slightly ajar when she knew she had locked it. Her laptop moved from its original spot, and the faint hum of new security cameras installed by Richard's men. He was no longer hiding his control. He was tightening his grip. That night, Emma checked her hidden footage and saw what she feared. Richard had been in her room again. This time, he wasn't looking. He was searching. He had opened drawers, flipped through papers, even tapped on walls as if testing for hollows. And then, the camera caught him standing before the painting. The watchful eye. He stared at it for nearly a full minute. Then he left wordless. Emma didn't sleep that night. She sat awake, listening to the echo of her grandfather's voice in her memory. The truth always survives, but only if you protect it. The next morning, the storm came, a literal one. Thunder rolled in from the hills, rain hammering the estate's roof with relentless fury. The old house groaned as if it could sense the tension inside. Richard called for her that afternoon. He sat in the study, papers spread across the desk. His smile was polite but sharp, the kind that hides a blade behind every word. He told her that certain accounts had been frozen, that the inheritance process might be delayed, and that the lawyer's office had been contacted about discrepancies. Emma understood immediately. He was covering his tracks, preparing to accuse her of fraud if the truth came out. But she also noticed something behind him, her grandfather's old wall safe, its door cracked slightly open, and beside it, the faint smell of smoke. Hours later, while she reviewed the footage from the study cameras, her heart sank. Richard had set fire to documents. She watched as he fed papers into a metal bin one by one, his expression cold and determined. Some were old account records. Others, she realized with horror, were personal letters, evidence of her grandfather's connection to the original will. He wasn't just erasing the paper trail. He was erasing history. Emma needed to act fast. The only copies of the evidence that mattered were hidden in her room and uploaded online, but the flash drives were her safety net. If he found them, it was over. That night, while the rain masked her movements, she quietly retrieved the drives from behind the watchful eye. She wrapped them in a waterproof pouch and left the house, heading through the back gardens toward the old gardener's shed. It was one of the few places Richard had ignored, a crumbling structure on the far edge of the property. She hid the pouch beneath a loose floorboard and marked the spot with a small nail. When she returned to the mansion, she found Richard waiting at the door. His expression was calm, too calm. He asked her where she'd been, and though she tried to sound casual, his eyes studied her every movement. He said he'd been worried, that there had been a small electrical fire in the east wing. He told her not to panic, but she noticed the faint trace of soot on his sleeve. Something was burning again. An hour later, she smelled the smoke. She ran through the halls toward her bedroom, the smell thickening, choking. When she opened the door, flames were licking across the carpet, climbing the walls. The fire alarm blared, and smoke filled the corridor. Richard's men rushed in, shouting, pretending to help. But through the chaos, Emma saw the truth. They were focusing on the painting, tearing it down, smashing it open. They were searching for her evidence. Emma barely escaped the fire that night. The house's fire suppression system eventually stopped the blaze, but her room, and everything inside it, was destroyed. The next morning, she stood outside the blackened doorway as Richard spoke to the police. He played the role of the grieving uncle, blaming faulty wiring and insisting he'd saved his niece from disaster. The officers seemed to believe him, but what he didn't know was that the fire hadn't destroyed her proof. It had only burned his illusions. Later that night, when the house was silent again, Emma slipped out to the shed. She lifted the floorboard and checked the pouch. All 5 drives were safe, but she found something else she hadn't placed there, a folded envelope with her name written in her grandfather's handwriting. Her pulse quickened. Inside the envelope was a note, dated 6 months before his death. Emma, if you are reading this, then Richard has made his move. I left something he can never fake, never forge, and never destroy. It's not in the safe, nor the will, but in the story of this house. Find the ledger beneath the piano room floor. It holds the truth about what he took from me. Let the truth defend itself. Emma read the note 3 times, her hands trembling. Her grandfather had anticipated this. All of it. And now she had another piece of the puzzle. As the wind howled through the broken windows of the shed, she looked back toward the glowing remains of the mansion. Her uncle thought he had destroyed her. He thought the evidence was gone. But he was wrong. The real proof, and her revenge, was only beginning. The fire had changed everything. The Whitmore estate now stood half broken, walls blackened, paintings blistered, and the scent of smoke seeping through every hall. But for Emma, that destruction only cleared a path to the truth her grandfather had hidden beneath the surface. For days, Richard busied himself with insurance claims, press statements, and forced sympathy. He spoke of family tragedy and electrical mishaps, all while tightening control over the property. He dismissed the new security team and replaced them with men loyal only to him. He was rebuilding the house, and his lies, brick by brick. But while he looked outward, Emma's focus turned inward, beneath the piano room. That's where her grandfather had pointed her. The piano room was one of the few parts of the mansion untouched by fire. It sat quietly at the far end of the east wing, its grand instrument still gleaming beneath the chandelier, as if the chaos outside had never reached it. The room held memories, Emma's first lessons, her grandfather's calm voice guiding her fingers along the keys, the smell of cedar from the old wood panels. She waited until the house was empty. Richard had gone into town to meet the estate lawyer. Before she began her search, the floorboards creaked under her feet as she knelt beside the grand piano. She ran her hands along the baseboards, tapping each plank gently. After several minutes, she found one that sounded hollow. With the help of a small screwdriver from the maintenance closet, she pried it open. Beneath the dust and cobwebs lay a small, metal box, unmarked, cold and surprisingly heavy. Her heart pounded as she lifted it free. Inside, she found an old leather-bound ledger, its pages yellowed and brittle. The first few entries were mundane: expenses, estate notes, repair records. But as she turned the pages, her pulse quickened. The later entries were written in her grandfather's distinct, slanted handwriting. But the content was anything but ordinary. It was a record of financial transfers, hidden accounts, and property deeds, all signed by Richard. Her uncle had been siphoning money from the family business for years. Small amounts at first, just enough to go unnoticed. But over time, the transactions grew bolder, larger, spread across shell companies and offshore accounts. Her grandfather had discovered it long before his death, and had been documenting every single detail. And then, on the final page, Emma found a short note. "If anything happens to me, let this record speak. The one who steals in secret always fears the truth made public." Emma stared at the words until her eyes burned. Her grandfather hadn't just suspected betrayal. He had known it, and he had chosen to protect her not with wealth, but with truth. She scanned the pages quickly, taking photos with her phone. Then she hid the ledger in her bag and returned the metal box to its place beneath the floor. If Richard realized she had it, he'd stop at nothing to destroy it. That evening, Richard returned early. His mood was sour, his eyes red with frustration. He told her that the lawyers were being difficult, and that certain documents regarding the estate's transfer were missing. Emma said nothing, pretending ignorance. But she noticed the twitch in his jaw, the way his hands shook slightly when he spoke. He was unraveling. That night, she went through the recordings she had collected over the past weeks, audio, video, and screenshots of financial data. Piece by piece, she started building her case. But she needed something more, something that couldn't be dismissed as coincidence or digital manipulation. She needed Richard to incriminate himself. The next morning, she planted the bait. In a folder left deliberately open on her laptop, she saved a document labeled Ledger Scans. Final proof. Then she left her door unlocked and the laptop running while she pretended to take a phone call in the garden. Within 15 minutes, the motion sensor in her room went off. Through her concealed camera feed, she watched Richard enter. He approached the desk, looked around, and sat down. He opened the folder, brows furrowing as he scrolled through the images. His face darkened. Then he picked up the phone and called someone, a number Emma didn't recognize. His words were sharp and angry. Though the microphone only caught fragments, she heard enough. "Destroy everything. She knows, not a word to the lawyer until I handle it." It was exactly what she needed. That night, she downloaded the footage and saved multiple encrypted backups. But before she could move the files to the drives, she heard a sound that froze her blood. Footsteps in the hallway, then a faint knock at her door. Richard's voice followed. Calm, too calm. He told her they needed to talk privately. She turned off her screen, slid her phone into her pocket, and opened the door a crack. Richard stood there with a faint smile, holding 2 glasses of wine. He said he wanted to celebrate. The new insurance payout, a chance to start over. Emma felt her throat tighten. She declined politely, claiming exhaustion. His smile faded slightly, but he didn't argue. He set 1 glass on her nightstand and said she could drink it later. Then he left, closing the door behind him. As soon as his footsteps disappeared, Emma locked the door. She stared at the glass for several minutes, then poured it into the sink. The faint chemical smell confirmed her worst fear. He had drugged it. Her uncle wasn't just trying to steal anymore. He was trying to silence her. That night, she didn't sleep. She spent the hours in silence, backing up every file, every video, every document. She sent copies to a trusted friend from college, a law student who had once worked in a legal archive. By dawn, she had everything secured. But as the sun rose and the light crept through the broken curtains, she noticed something strange. The piano room door, the one she had sealed after retrieving the ledger, was open again. She rushed down the hall and froze at the sight before her. The floorboards she had replaced were gone. The space beneath them empty. The metal box, gone. And on the piano itself a single note written in Richard's handwriting. "You should have stayed out of it, Emma." The truth was no longer hidden, but neither was she. The morning after the discovery, Emma's world felt hollow. Every shadow stretched longer, every sound sharper, every breath heavy with dread. The piano room stood as a crime scene of silence. Her heart pounded as she knelt beside the empty floorboards where the ledger had been hidden. The faint outline of dust showed where the box once lay, a ghost of the evidence she had risked everything to uncover. Richard had outplayed her for now, but what he didn't realize was that she had already copied every page. Still, the message he left on the piano chilled her, not for what it said, but for what it implied. He wasn't trying to hide anymore. He knew she knew, and now the game had changed. That day, Emma moved cautiously through the mansion, pretending everything was normal. Richard avoided her most of the time, but she could feel his eyes on her. Through the gaps in the stairwell, the mirrors in the hall, the faint reflections in the window glass. He was watching her, waiting for her to slip. At lunch, she noticed subtle changes. The staff, once friendly, now avoided her gaze. The gardener who used to greet her with a smile turned away. The cook whispered nervously when Emma entered the kitchen. Richard had turned everyone against her, feeding them lies. Perhaps that she was unstable, obsessed, even dangerous. But Emma didn't need their approval anymore. She needed justice. That evening, she set her plan into motion. She still had the recordings, every suspicious conversation, every incriminating phone call. But she needed something undeniable, something that couldn't be spun as misunderstanding or fabrication. She needed Richard to prove his own guilt on record. The first step was psychological. She knew her uncle's ego. His pride was both his weapon and his weakness. If she could provoke it, he'd unravel himself. She began subtly. She printed a single page from the ledger. One of the entries that showed a large transfer to a fake company. She folded it neatly and slipped it into the morning mail pile that Richard always reviewed personally. When he found it, she watched from across the dining room as his face blanched. He turned the paper over several times, scanning for markings for clues. Then he looked up, searching the room, his gaze finally landing on her. Emma lowered her eyes, pretending to focus on her coffee. From that moment on, Richard couldn't hide his paranoia. He began pacing late into the night, locking his study, whispering angrily on his phone. The house echoed with the sound of drawers slamming and footsteps stomping down hallways. By the third day, his composure had cracked completely. Emma knew it was time. She had arranged everything carefully. Hidden cameras were set throughout the mansion. The study, the piano room, the main hall. Each lens disguised within ordinary objects, a lamp base, a clock, a photo frame. The recordings fed directly to a cloud backup she'd secured under a fake name. Her final move was risky but necessary. She had to lure him into confession. That night, Emma staged a call in the living room loud enough for him to overhear. She spoke as if to her lawyer, mentioning the original ledger, recorded proof, and a meeting tomorrow morning. Then she placed a USB drive on the coffee table, empty, of course, and left the house, pretending to drive into town. In reality, she parked a few streets away and connected her phone to the hidden feed from the living room camera. She didn't have to wait long. Richard entered minutes later, his face twisted in anger and fear. He stared at the USB drive as if it were poison. Then he snatched it up, muttering to himself. He called someone, the same contact from before, and hissed words that would later seal his fate. She found everything. The money, the transfers. It's all in her hands. If this gets out, we're finished. I need it gone tonight. Emma watched, heart racing, as he poured whiskey into a glass, then hurled it at the wall. The camera caught everything. The fury, the confession, the desperation. When she finally returned to the house hours later, she found Richard pretending to sleep in his study. The USB drive was gone from the table. She said nothing, only wished him a quiet goodnight, her face unreadable. In her room, she uploaded the footage to multiple safe locations, attaching it to a scheduled email that would automatically send if she failed to cancel it by morning. One copy was addressed to the family lawyer, another to the local paper. By dawn, Richard's downfall was inevitable. But then something unexpected happened. A soft knock came at her door. Not his this time, but the maid Maria. Her eyes were swollen, her hands trembling. She told Emma that Richard had fired half the staff overnight. He claimed they were loyal to her. Then Maria handed her a folded envelope. Inside was a torn piece of the ledger. The same handwriting, the same ink. But not one Emma had seen before. The note read, "If you're reading this, I trust you've found the truth. But the real danger isn't the money. It's what he did before your father died." "Look closer." Emma froze. Before her father died. Her breath caught. Her grandfather's words suddenly meant something deeper. The theft was only part of the story. The ledger wasn't just financial evidence. It was a trail leading to something much darker. She tore through her folders, rereading every image she'd saved. And there, between pages of bank transfers and property deeds, she noticed an unfamiliar entry, a payment to a private clinic dated 2 days before her father's sudden stroke. A clinic her uncle had connections to. The realization hit her like thunder. Her father's death hadn't been natural. Richard hadn't just stolen money. He had stolen lives. Emma sat frozen in shock as the camera feed blinked quietly on her laptop, the recordings uploading in the background. She wasn't just avenging her inheritance anymore. She was about to expose a murderer. Morning crept through the windows like a reluctant truth. The house, usually so still, felt alive with tension, as if the walls themselves knew what was coming. Emma had barely slept. The revelation from the night before had shattered every remaining illusion she had about her uncle, her family, and the quiet lies that had kept their name untarnished. Her father's death, the one everyone said was sudden, peaceful, and natural, was beginning to look like something planned. Something deliberate. The payment from the ledger wasn't random. It had gone to a medical consultant, one who specialized in assisted transitions for terminal patients. But her father had never been terminal. He had been strong, recovering, hopeful, until he wasn't. Now, Emma knew, the inheritance wasn't the only thing her uncle had wanted. He wanted control, total and absolute. And her father had been the last obstacle in his way. As the sun rose, Emma moved through the mansion one final time. Every room carried echoes of the past. The faint scent of her father's cigars, the old piano her mother used to play, the empty hall where laughter once lived. But now, those memories were weapons. Every whisper of the past reminded her what she was fighting for. Downstairs, Richard was already awake. He stood by the study window sipping coffee, wearing that same mask of calm superiority that had fooled so many for so long. He had no idea how close his empire was to burning down. Emma had scheduled everything to unfold that day. The automatic emails, the video files, the hidden recordings. By noon, they would reach the family lawyer, the police, and the media outlet she had secretly contacted weeks earlier. The truth would no longer belong to her, it would belong to the world. Still, a part of her wanted to face him. To see his face when he realized he'd lost everything. She entered the study quietly. Richard didn't turn around at first, assuming she'd come to apologize, to make peace, to accept his control. But when she set her phone on the desk, the screen playing the video of his confession, he finally froze. The image showed him pacing in the living room, muttering his own guilt into the dark. Emma said nothing. She didn't need to. The silence between them was louder than any accusation. Richard's eyes darted to the screen, then to her. For a moment, his face betrayed the truth, the panic, the realization that every lie, every crime, every secret he'd buried was now uncovered. He stammered, but Emma didn't move. Her calm frightened him more than anger ever could. When the first call came from his lawyer, he knew it was over. He answered it, his voice shaking, and within minutes, the color drained from his face. The firm had received everything. The ledgers, the recordings, the emails. And worse, the police had already been informed. Emma stood in the doorway as he clutched the phone, whispering frantic denials that no one believed. His hands trembled as he demanded to know who had sent it all, but deep down, he already knew. As he turned toward her, Emma saw something shift in him, rage replacing fear. He lunged toward her, shouting words she barely registered, but she didn't flinch. She stepped back just in time for the front door to burst open. 2 officers entered, flanked by the family lawyer, Mr. Clarkson. The timing was perfect. The plan had worked to the very last second. Richard tried to talk his way out, but the evidence was undeniable. The lawyer handed the officers a folder containing the verified documents and digital timestamps. The proof was airtight. The confrontation was short. Richard's empire crumbled in minutes. His properties frozen, his accounts seized, his reputation destroyed. He screamed as they led him away, spitting curses and threats, but none of it mattered. The world outside was already hearing the story. Emma stood at the window, watching the car drive away. For the first time in years, she felt the air clear, like the storm had finally broken. The mansion, stripped of deceit, felt lighter somehow. Yet, even in victory, there was sorrow. Justice couldn't bring her father back. It couldn't undo the years of manipulation and fear, but it could give him peace. It could give her closure. The lawyer approached her later that afternoon, handing her a sealed envelope. Inside was a letter from her father, one written weeks before his death, one Richard had likely hidden. In it, her father wrote about his hopes for her, his regret for trusting his brother too much, and his wish that she would never let greed destroy her. He ended the letter with a line that broke her completely. If you ever have to choose between vengeance and truth, choose truth. It may hurt longer, but it heals cleaner. Emma wept quietly, holding the letter to her chest. Her revenge had started with anger, but it ended with truth, and that made all the difference. Weeks later, the mansion was no longer a prison of memories. The staff returned, the rooms were opened, and life slowly filled the halls again. Emma didn't sell the estate despite the offers. She chose to restore it, not as a symbol of wealth, but of integrity. In the main hallway, she hung 2 portraits side by side, her father's and her mother's. Beneath them, she placed a small brass plaque engraved with the words, "The truth outlives the greedy." And beside it, on a pedestal, she placed a small camera, the one that had recorded everything. It stood as a silent guardian, a reminder that no matter how carefully lies are crafted, the truth always finds a lens to capture it. Months later, Emma received a letter from the authorities. Richard had confessed, not just to the theft, but to orchestrating their father's treatment, to accelerate his inheritance. His confession came after he learned about the overwhelming evidence, and perhaps after he realized that the family he had tried to control no longer existed. Emma didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her revenge was complete, not with destruction, but with revelation. As she walked through the garden that evening, the wind carried a familiar calm. The roses her father planted years ago swayed gently, their petals glowing in the sunset. She could almost hear his voice, calm, proud, at peace. For the first time in her life, Emma smiled not from victory, but from freedom.